time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Jesse Hagopian. Jesse Hagopian is a teacher at Garfield High School. He is also editor of the book More Than a Score, the new Uprising Against High-Stakes Testing, and editor for Rethinking Schools magazine. In addition, he is a Seattle Education Fellow at the Progressive Magazine and blogs at IamAnEducator.com. Jesse, thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me in this morning.
So, last week you were in Washington, D.C. at a Save Our Schools March and Rally and spoke about the police shooting of Philandro Castile and specifically, quote, for Black Lives to Matter, Black education has to matter too. Can you talk about that in the rally?
Absolutely. It was a wonderful experience to get to join together with national leaders in the struggle against corporate education reform. And we gathered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And I got to give a speech there to try to make this connection between the Black Lives Matter movement and a struggle against corporate reform and for Black education to matter too. And I think that the police murder of Philandro Castile really puts into perspective what's at stake in this struggle. Philandro Castile was a cafeteria worker, an educator at J.J. Hill Elementary School in Minnesota. And he knew the names of all 500 kids that he served breakfast and lunch to. He knew their food preferences and their food allergies, and was described by his community as deeply caring and providing individual attention to all these kids. And when the police pulled him over, they didn't see a mentor or an educator, right? As his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, said, she had to release that live Facebook feed of the police standing over her boyfriend's dead body because she wanted the world to see that the police aren't here to protect and serve, but really to punish Black bodies. And, you know, this is a crisis that we have in our society today that's been going on really from the beginning, you know, with the history of police coming out of the slave patrols in policing Black bodies during slavery. And I think that when you can look at the way they're shooting down Black bodies in the streets, but I think that has to be a central movement of the Black Lives Matter movement. But I also think that they are killing our minds in the schools as well. And that was the case that I made at the Save Our Schools rally, that we have to struggle on both fronts, right? That in our schools, you know, right here in Seattle, there are disproportionate suspension rates that are truly appalling. You know, Black students are suspended in Seattle at 4 times the rates of white students for the very same infractions, all right? And this forms what we know as a school-to-prison pipeline. And that pipeline extends really across the country. I think the pipeline begins with a curriculum that is irrelevant to many students of color, and really covers over the struggles that communities of color have engaged in for centuries. And we saw that best this year when a student named Kobe in Texas opened up his textbook to the page assigned by the teacher, and they were studying slavery, and he looks down and he sees, in fact, the word slave is erased, and it says African workers were brought over to work on the plantations in the South. And he took a picture of that textbook and texted it to his mom, and he said, "We was real good workers, wasn't we, Mom?" Right? And, you know, it took this student to point out this egregious whitewashing of history that erased the forced labor and tried to make it seem like these were just your everyday workers. It took a student to notice that, and the mom pointed this out in a Facebook video she posted that went viral, showing all the PhDs and important people that had signed off on this McGraw-Hill textbook. And it wasn't just that they'd replaced the word slave with worker. The real problem was that they had put the section on slavery in the portion of the textbook, the chapter on immigration, as if black people from Africa had immigrated to the United States just looking for a better life, right? That black people were coming here searching for the American dream instead of the reality that we were shackled in the Middle Passage and treated worse than animals, right? So I think the school to prison pipeline starts with the curriculum that disregards the struggles of black people. Then when students act out, it's called disobedience, but maybe it's resistance to a racist curriculum. And then there's zero tolerance discipline policies and disproportionate suspensions that push them out of school. You have high stakes tests that deny them graduation. If they don't pass these tests that are often irrelevant to the real struggles that they face in their lives. Often these multiple choice bubble tests don't really measure the critical thinking skills, the creativity, the collaboration skills that really matter most to young people trying to figure out how to create a better world. Denies them graduation, you know, and then pushes them into a system where we spend more to incarcerate people than to educate them. And that's really why I think we need to begin connecting the fight for black lives with the struggle to make black education matter.
You edited a book specifically about testing. Talk more about that. When did you first get involved with that and notice there was a serious problem there?
Well, I began teaching in 2001 just as No Child Left Behind Act was coming online. You know, that was George Bush's signature education legislation, but it was a bipartisan vote in Congress that celebrated ushering in this new era of what they called accountability. And the idea was we are going to roll out this high-stakes standardized testing regime across the country, and we'll punish people that don't score well on these exams. And I began teaching in Washington, D.C., in one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in the country. And I would pass by the halls of government and the White House and the monuments, and then I'd cross the Anacostia River in a place that's been completely forsaken. And I would try to educate students who were hungry, whose families have been brutalized by police and locked up, kids facing deep trauma, scarce resources. I had a hole in the ceiling of my classroom, and I realized that hole because I came in on Monday to grade one of the first papers I'd ever assigned, first projects, and I couldn't grade the projects because it had rained in the classroom and flooded my room. There was standing water all over, and it had destroyed their projects. And so here I am being asked to educate away poverty, educate away social ills, and then not given the resources to do it, or even a classroom that keeps out the elements. but being told by federal education legislation that I need to be held accountable as an educator, as a teacher. I'm the one responsible, and that these kids need to be held accountable to their learning. And so this test and punish regime was rolled out, and what it did was label and stigmatize black children, children of color, children living in poverty across the country, blame them for their conditions, and then shut down their schools. You know, the schools labeled failing with these tests were then closed en masse across the country, further destabilizing neighborhoods and communities, and then sometimes reopened as charter schools so they could be privatized and run by private entities unaccountable to democratically elected leadership. And so this was the privatization agenda that we saw rolled out, and really we saw that the No Child Left Behind Act had nothing to do with supporting or nurturing children, and had everything to do with a for-profit mentality, a privatizing mentality. And the test scores were the centerpiece of this whole corporate education reform agenda. They were it's really all about reducing the intellectual and the emotional process of teaching and learning to a single score that you can use to then punish children, that you can use to then punish teachers and punish schools. And I think one of the most devastating effects that this high-stakes standardized testing regime has had on our schools is the way it's fueled the school-to-prison pipeline, especially targeting students of color. And there was a recent study that came out of Boston University that shows the only outcome, the only measurable outcome of attaching high stakes to exit exams, requiring students to pass these tests to graduate from high school, is increased incarceration rates, right? And that's a study that none of these corporate education reformers care to talk about. You won't see that in any of the glossy brochures about the way to reform our schools pumped out by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? They have no response to that study. And to me, that's a really damning indictment of what some of the richest people in the world have used their money to further high-stakes testing. And I'm proud to say that teachers in Seattle have stood up against this testocracy, as I call them, and parents and students in this city have been at the forefront of a revolt against the testocracy, and have helped launch what's now become the largest uprising against high-stakes testing in U.S. history. And, you know, this education spring, as it's been come to be known, really got launched in 2013. And, you know, when the educators voted unanimously at Garfield High School to refuse to administer the MAP test, the measures of academic progress, we did so because we knew this test was culturally and linguistically inappropriate for our English language learners, that it was an absurd measure for our special education students, that it wasn't aligned to our curriculum, so that it was testing kids on subjects we weren't even supposed to be teaching them in school, and then labeling them failing when they didn't know something they hadn't even been taught because it wasn't in the state standards for that grade level. And, you know, we took a stand and said, we're going to refuse to administer this test. And, you know, teachers took a big risk. The superintendent at the time threatened the teachers in the tested subject areas with a 10-day suspension without pay. And it was the overwhelming solidarity of the unanimous vote of the PTA, the unanimous vote of the student body government and the Black Student Union, the support of the Seattle NAACP, and thousands of parents, students, and teachers from around the country flooding Garfield High School with messages of solidarity that really kept the teachers safe in this struggle. And instead of suspending any of the teachers, by the end of the school year, the superintendent had to back off his threat and then announce that the MAP test was now optional for all of Seattle's high schools altogether. And that was really the result of the struggle spreading to 7 other schools across Seattle, and the wide opposition to this idea of just endlessly ranking and sorting our students with tests rather than supporting them. You know, I've said that the mentality that you would have to believe that this high-stakes standardized testing regime is helping our students. You know, there's the average student in the American public school system today takes 110 standardized tests, right? An outlandish amount of testing that is robbing kids of precious classroom time for real learning, and it's just become test prep, right? And the type of thinking that you would have that 110 standardized tests is real learning is the same kind of thinking you'd have if you see a kid shaking uncontrollably, clearly suffering from hypothermia, and you go and take that kid's temperature, and then you take the kid's temperature again and again and again and again and again and again and 110 times before you decide to wrap that kid in a blanket, right? We as educators know that it's our duty to go and wrap that kid in a blanket, to wrap them in the wraparound services that they deserve, that they need to nurture them, the after-school programs, the tutoring programs, right? The counseling services that they need. You know, not too long ago, Seattle abolished counseling for all elementary schools so that only the schools that could raise the money through private funds or the PTA could keep a counselor for elementary school students, right? And so here we are in a situation of great contradiction where this state can find the money to just shovel money to Boeing, right? Some $9 billion in tax breaks to Boeing, but they can't find the money to keep the counselors for elementary school students, or to lower the class sizes as voters voted to do, or nurture and support our kids. And so we have some of the wealthiest corporations the world has ever seen, from Starbucks to Boeing to Amazon to Microsoft in this area. There is no excuse for the lack of resources that our kids are suffering under in this state. And yet, because our state legislators are bought and paid for by these very corporations, they are just refusing to listen to the judicial branch of the state and the state Supreme Court mandate in the McCleary decision that says they have to fully fund education. In fact, that the state constitution reads, it's the paramount duty of the state government to fund education. And so the state legislature is just refusing to do so. And instead, they want to implement these high-stakes tests to register the fact that we don't have the resources provided to the schools, and then punish students and teachers for lower scores. And I think that that's a society in crisis that's in need of fundamental transformation. We have to take the power away from the wealthiest in this state and this nation that are hoarding the resources for themselves and denying it to our children and our schools, and instead pushing police and prisons as the solution to our society in crisis, and I reject that.
Talk a little bit more about the companies, corporations that are involved with producing these tests. I didn't realize till I was listening to a talk by you recently that the origins of the SAT test, which I remember stressing out and taking when I was in school, goes all the way back to the eugenics movement.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that the Black Lives Matter movement should be very aware of, the racist origins of high-stakes standardized testing, because once you know about the origins of these tests, you will never again fall for the lie that high-stakes standardized testing is somehow part of a new civil rights movement. That's what these corporate reformers claim, that they're creating an accountability system through the use of these tests that will support learning for our kids of color and close the achievement gap, right? But the fact is that standardized testing was introduced into the public schools in the early 1900s as a conscious project of eugenicists, right? This fake pseudoscience that was in place as an effort to try to prove white supremacy. Not just white supremacy, but eugenics was also interested in proving male supremacy, improving native-born supremacy over immigrants, and even hierarchies among white people and Europeans, right? They wanted to prove the superiority of the northern Nordic white people over the swarthy Mediterraneans, right? This really grotesque ideology that has been thoroughly disproven by scientists over and over again. And it was a man named Carl Brigham who was one of the leading proponents of eugenics. He wrote a book called A Study in American Intelligence, which was considered one of the Bibles of eugenics. And the conclusion of that book, it wraps up on the last page saying, America's in deep trouble. We're going to fall behind the rest of the world in intelligence because we have so many black people here, and as opposed to Europe. Well, this is a man who left his post at Princeton during World War I to implement the alpha and beta tests to conscripts in the Army. And these multiple choice tests, not too different than what we have today, were used to rank and sort the troops. The idea was they could decide who was officer material and who was grunt material to die in the trenches. And when the war was over, he returned to Princeton and he adapted these alpha and beta tests into the SAT exam, right? And by 1920, 4 million students across the country were being administered standardized tests, mostly for the purposes of tracking students into the level of courses that they were supposed to match their intelligence, so that the school would know who was on the low track and who was on the high track, who was going to be ready for manual labor or low-wage work, and which students would be ready to help run society and be in positions of power. And we see the use of these tests in the exact same way today. The MAP test, for example, was the test that was used to determine who was going to be in the advanced placement programs in middle school, right? And those classes are overwhelmingly white. Today, the new Common Core test, the Smarter Balance assessment, is now the gatekeeper to an overwhelmingly white HCC, highly capable program. And we see the use of high-stakes standardized tests being used to segregate students, to exacerbate segregation, and to continue to track students. And we see the same ranking and sorting system from the 1920s on our schools today to have students internalize their self-worth, right? To have them understand their place in society, right? So I think that those in power will use the police when they need to repress movements. We saw that with Occupy, when people gained a consciousness that 1% of the population have far too much of the wealth. They used the police to raid the encampments of folks fighting back and trying to reclaim the wealth. But they don't use the police primarily to hold back people from creating a just society. I think that the main way they do that is having people internalize their self-worth by understanding that, well, I didn't do so well in school, or I scored bad on this test, so it's probably okay that I'm in this low-wage job. Or probably those people who are running society did well on these tests, and they're probably in their right place in power. And trying to convince people of that through our school system and this high-stakes testing regime, I think, is part of why these tests exist, and I think they really have nothing to do with intelligence. Study after study has shown what these tests measure more than anything else is your access to resources, your zip code, not your aptitude.
Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but briefly I wanted you to touch on, you had just won money for being pepper sprayed after, I believe, an MLK march, and are doing amazing things with that. Can you talk about that briefly?
Absolutely, yes. On Martin Luther King Day last year, I was pepper sprayed in the face by Seattle police officer Sandra De La Fuente, and when she assaulted me with pepper spray in the face, I was on the phone with my mom trying to get a ride to my son's 2-year-old birthday party, posing no threat at all. And, you know, the Office of Professional Accountability ruled in my favor and said that I had been doing nothing wrong and she should get a 1-day suspension without pay. Instead, the chief of police, O'Toole, intervened in my case and said that there would be no meaningful punishment to this officer, canceled the 1-day suspension without pay to a mere verbal reprimand. And I was able to recently settle my case with the city. I won a $100,000 settlement with the city, which I want to make clear is not justice at all. Justice would be some accountability for that officer, but it will fund struggles for justice, because I'm really happy to say that I'm using the funds to start the Black Education Matters Student Activist Award, and I already was able to award 3 magnificent student activists who have been in the struggle for Black lives, have been in the struggle for educational justice. And I will every year be granting student recipients with a $1,000 award and community recognition for their great work. And I hope that supporting these young people in their struggles will help further this movement.
All right. Well, unfortunately, with that, we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me on the show today, Mike.